Hi, folks. Welcome. We are live from Only Theater. It's Beauty and the Body. I hope that that's where you're planning to be. A fabulous discussion about casting directors, images of beauty, representation, film, television, and the stage. I have four amazing folks with me, and I'm going to introduce them to you in a second. My name is Jason Loweth. I'm the artistic director with Only Theater Center. And before I introduce my panelists, I just want to talk briefly about why we thought this conversation was so important. As many of you know, we just started performances at Only Theater Center in Maryland with our annual holiday show. Every year we do a holiday show. This year it happens to be Beauty and the Beast. Our holiday show usually gets about 10,000 plus attendees, and amongst them hundreds of kids for whom this is their first professional show. And knowing that what they see on stage is so important, we always pay particular attention to how we cast them, these shows. This year with this show, we had an opportunity to do something really special. Some of you may have read the great article about our casting actually in the Washington Post last week, and here I'm just going to quote how it begins. It starts with Jade Jones. Jade Jones was surprised when she landed one of the leads in the Only Theater Center production of Beauty and the Beast. As a self-described queer plus-size Black woman, she hadn't expected to be seen as right for Belle, the fairy tale heroine who's an ivory skin size 2, or so it looks in Disney's animated film, subsequently adapted for Broadway. I'm not the typical Belle type, obviously, she says, but she now understands how her Belle fits into this production, directed with an eye to inclusiveness by Marsha Milgram Dodge, and co-starring Evan Ruggiero, an acclaimed tap dancer and actor who lost a leg to cancer as a teenager. At Only, the Menken-scored fable drills down on redefining beauty and what that means and what it means to know your worth and to own it, Jones notes. So that's how we at Only Theater are celebrating a generous spirit of the holidays. In all three of our theaters, in fact, we're trying to get our empathy muscles back in shape after a long pandemic-induced hiatus, right? We've got Belle, if you're putting yourself in Belle's shoes, maybe you're putting yourself in Hedwig's high heels, performed by trans performer Mason Alexander Park, or Scrooge's moth-eaten slippers. We're making sure everyone in our community is seen on our stages this season because visibility matters, representation matters. So that's why we're here to talk about how representation on stage and film, especially as regards received notions of beauty, affects self-image and how those standards might finally be changing. Let me introduce our amazing panelists. Vickie Thomas, so delighted to introduce Vickie Thomas of Vickie Thomas Casting in Los Angeles. Vickie is one of the busiest casting directors in Hollywood with credits that span many of the most compelling and complex stories that you've seen on your screen. In addition to being Quentin Tarantino's go-to casting director, her work has won Emmy, Artios, Black Reel, and other awards for shows and movies like Watchmen, Detroit, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Hidden Figures, Straight Outta Compton, and much more. And as I was just saying before we started, yesterday's Washington Post had a great article about another movie that she has cast, the new all-Black Western remake, The Harder They Fall. Welcome, Vickie.
Thank you.
Geoff, Josselson, and Katja Zarolinski, both highly regarded Broadway, off-Broadway, and regional casting directors on their own, joined forces just before the pandemic. Great timing, you guys, to start Jay-Z Casting in New York. And between the two of them, they can boast decades, literally, of work, despite their young-looking selves, on some of the industry's most exciting new and classic work. Their regional casting includes most of what you see, those of you in the DC area, at Arena Stage here in town, and anytime anything from Arena moves somewhere else, as well as many of the country's leading regional theaters. Colleagues and friends, welcome both of you, Katja and Geoff. Thanks for being here. Last but not least, my colleague in arms, Jose Carrasquillo, was named Director of Artistic Programming at Ford's Theater back in 2018, where he oversees casting for their productions, which, unlike many companies in the area, including Only's, feature all local ensembles. He moved to DC in the 1980s, has since directed all over the region. He's been artistic director of not one but two theaters, and most recently, just before the pandemic, won the Helen Hayes Award for direction for his production of The Brothers' Size by Terrell McCraney before the pandemic. Jose, great to see you. Thank you. So, and folks, as you are watching, feel free to ask questions and Our amazing technology hosts will get those questions to us, and we'll try to answer any as we go. We're going to be very casual and just have a really great conversation. So let's start. I want to start with something really obvious. Almost, what is it that a casting director really does for those people who don't know? I mean, when I remember my first job in 1993, I was an assistant director in Los Angeles at a production at a teeny tiny 99-seat theater that was looking for 10 roles, and we had, I think, 2,000 headshots and resumes. And I remember the director said to me, he and I went at his house, went through the headshots and resumes, and he said to me, if you spend more than 5 seconds on a headshot, you've wasted our time. And that's how I learned what casting was. I'd like to think that it's a little bit different. Let's start in the familiar world, and I'm going to throw this to Katja. Why not? Can you talk about how long the casting process is in theater, and at what point does the casting director play that most influential role?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it does vary. Ideally, we would like a few months of run-on time, but just logistically, if you're working with an equity theater or a theater that uses actors that are a part of Actors Equity, there is a process that sometimes starts at the theater or sometimes starts with us, which is their big EPA or equity principal auditions. If it's a musical, there's also an equity chorus call. Casting or the theater themselves needs to give Actors Equity 2 weeks in order to get those open calls set up. All open calls must happen before the casting director can bring in actors for appointments for the theater. So we're talking minimum, and sometimes that is tricky. There would be a minimum of like 2 months before rehearsals, but ideally, casting in New York City, we like to get a runtime not too far out, but like 4 to 6 months before first rehearsal is typically, I would say, when we are brought in an ideal world in casting. We then have to compete with some theaters, like in DC, y'all cast a little bit earlier sometimes, especially with your local actors. So sometimes those theaters from the regions get booked up, but that's about when we're brought in, ideally.
I think that's right. And Jose at Ford's, you all cast in terms, because you work, solely with local actors. You're like trying to nail people down, if I can say, a year out before a production,
or longer. Yes, the second that it makes it to the table of maybes, we begin to call actors to see, hey, and what are you doing beginning on this day? And yeah, and it's just, it's the strategy, because there a lot of our actors, local actors, are in high demand, and if somebody, a director or any of us, really want to consider that person, we just need to reach out to them. Interestingly enough, Jason, as you know, now other theaters, the Shakespeare Theater and Signature, they're also starting, and even Arena, much earlier than before. So,
and especially frankly, as we know, because of the pandemic, the ranks of veteran actors are thinning. People are leaving. The Great Resignation is not just in every other field; it's also happening in theater. Vicky, at the other end of the spectrum from what Ford's is dealing with, film, web series, television, you all sometimes are casting up till like the day before shooting starts, it seems like.
Oh yeah, I have 2 parts at work on Friday. I'm trying to figure out what they're going to be. Yeah, the time varies. Really, it could be one project this past summer was you have 6 weeks. Another, the usual lead time for movies used to be about 12 weeks, about 3 months.
Yeah.
I'm starting to work a little bit on something that's going to shoot in a year and a half.
Wow.
Just
far away.
just in terms of sort of, I guess, feeding, the particular director I'm working with, and also helping them be able to let a potential financier know what they're thinking of, just the type of people they're thinking of. So yeah, it varies, it really just depends.
Yeah. I'm sure on Geoff and Katja, as you work on Broadway shows, there is a certain similarity in terms of attaching a particular name to a project, which helps the rest of it go that can go much later. But let me ask you, Geoff, as we start getting to the sort of meat of this conversation and why we're talking to you for how much power do you have? Where is your power, Geoff? How much power do you have when it comes to I go to see a show on Broadway or off Broadway or whatever that you've cast? How much power is, what is the extent of your power?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's something that I think people often don't understand about casting and what we do, and our power, which is, I think, a weird word because it doesn't feel like power, but I think it varies between projects and who we're working with and who our collaborators are, because there are certainly projects where we can sit back and look at somebody that maybe was cast in the show that was an idea of ours that we kind of shepherded through, and then there are cases where we're really there to help consult and deliver ideas to the team. I think overall, bigger picture wise, what a casting director does and is there to do is to present ideas to a creative team. So our abilities and our latitude really changes project to project and who we're working for. So we can certainly be maybe more influential in certain processes, but if a producer or a director don't want to go down a certain road, or they're not interested in maybe looking outside the box, we can certainly try to help guide them. But at the end of the day, the people who write the checks are the ones that are making the decisions. And there certainly have been cases where shows with our names on it are not always who we would have chosen, and it's more about the bigger picture and about our bigger picture collaboration with the team.
Sure.
And I think that goes back to what Vickie said also about just attaching people up front. Sometimes with Broadway shows or film and TV, you need to get certain names or actors just kind of set a year or two or more in advance, sometimes to make a project happen or to announce it. And that can sometimes be a case where a casting director can have a lot of influence, because those are places we're not necessarily doing auditions, and it's much more about the discussion and helping inform the team around who people are.
Are you feeling now, as we're coming out of the pandemic, and all of you are now sort of not that anyone really stopped, but certainly things seem to be gearing up much faster. Are you being is there more of an open mind amongst the folks, amongst directors, amongst producers, to say, find me different folks, find me folks beyond the box that I usually put them in? Is that something that you're feeling in the theater world? There's certainly been a call for that in the theater world. I can't speak to film and TV myself.
Yeah, I mean, Katja and I always talk about it because it's one of the things that kind of drew us together, just artistically, as I think we've always looked at casting in that way, and we've never really we don't like to subscribe to this idea of types or just looking at the artifice of it all, but looking at who this character is and what story they're telling, and being able to be as expansive as possible in how you can tell that story and how different actors and different energies might inform that story. So we've both been very lucky to be able to work with a lot of teams that in my 17 years in casting have been very excited and open-minded to explore things that are not on the face of it what it seems like it should be, but really look at it with a fresh lens. And then there's creative teams that really want that cookie cutter production, but I think that 2020, I think, and the shutdown brought some of these conversations in that we've already been having into a bigger national spotlight. And some of those creative teams that I think were maybe a little bit more resistant and or still don't really understand the conversation, or at least trying to engage in it a lot more, and are both allowing us to present them with different options and genuinely consider them, hopefully.
Is that, are you feeling that, are you feeling anything at all similar, Vickie, in terms of people moving away from, I don't know if there is such a thing as cookie cutter casting or cookie cutter production in film and TV, but that idea of typecasting feels like, you know, just get me an ingenue, get me a leading man, so on, that no longer has so much meaning.
I mean, I think it still exists. But I think with the push for diversity, it's kind of forced people to think beyond what they might initially have thought a role was going to be. I think with television and movies, I think there's more of a mandate from studios and streamers, and I mean, where it's a definite mandate to like, no, we are going to go diverse with this part. And that's something that I think has been different in the last 3 years, 4 years, something like that. When it's mandated, when it's not coming from a casting director or director wanting to shake it up, or what if their wife was a different ethnicity, or what, it's just, it was usually coming from the creatives involved in a project, but it is now more of a mandate from the studios, from the Apples, the Amazons, the streamers, I guess. So yeah, I think that does start to break into that stereotypical sort of, as Geoff was saying, cookie cutter casting, but that still exists as well. So you have to deal with both things, or all of the above. So
yeah, is it particular genres that are less hesitant? And I when I say genres, I'm not speaking just of television, also certainly theater genres. Are there particular genres where there's more reliance on tried and true formula?
Maybe like romantic comedies or love stories, maybe something like that. I'm guessing, as I start to think about that.
Well, I think so. The same thing on stage, when I think certain maybe generations of directors look at romantic stories and still have an idea that the man needs to be taller than the woman, or some basic things like that are not real life, but they still fall into those tropes.
Yeah,
sure.
But I think I don't know. I think it depends on the director, because I've worked on a lot of like old school, like old fashioned musicals where the director really wants to change it up, and there's a lot of new shows or new, either dramas or comedies where they want to just fall into like, oh, this girl needs to be beautiful. And I mean, I know we'll get into it, but like, what is beauty? Like, what does that mean?
Interestingly enough, I'm going to say that I think in media and in film, television, the producer plays a huge role, because you take something like Bridgerton, which was internationally popular. It comes from the top. This is what we're doing. This is the vision. And whoever directs that is going to have to kind of fall in line with that vision. And also, another thing, Jason, happening is that a lot of the awards for film and television, they're actually saying, in order for your film to qualify, you must have this percentage of BIPOC performers in your cast. And that's going to be instituted across the board. And that's going to have a significant, it'll be interesting to see the ones that do not follow that, how they're able to navigate that. But that's a huge thing. For us in theater, going back to your original question, because I have been a director for 3 decades, that's really what casting meant to me. At some point, I myself had to begin the process of how am I going to 3D-dimensionalize these characters, and you had to look at those resumes and all of that. In terms of today, I have to say that yes, what we have gone through, especially the issues of the, that came about with the racial reckoning and the We See You American theater, definitely directors are more aware. I have no power in the room, but I have tremendous influence. Also, I know you guys do this. We read the plays So they're very familiar to us, and we're storytellers. And we begin to see certain local actors in roles. And, you know, sometimes it's easier than other times because we can convince a director immediately. Other people need more convincing. So, you know, just a lot of things happening right now that I feel and I hope will continue to drive us to a better tomorrow in terms of representation and amplification of certain stories and certain point of views that were not there before, at least not in our industry.
Before I get to a question about beauty, I want to ask you right back, Jose. Do you think are audiences driving this desire for change? Are audiences demanding the change that we're seeing in casting, or are audiences following? What do you say? What do you think in terms of?
Well, you know, the reality is, and this is not a bad or good thing, it's just that our theater audiences are still majority white, middle-aged folks. I think they're following. I know from a leadership perspective that we want to change, you know, in many areas. I mean, it's an industry, it's a change of a culture, and I think we all have embraced it. My hope is that the audience will follow, definitely. I mean, I think this is really interesting. Maybe this is the silver lining, is that we are going to attract the younger audiences that were really not coming in the numbers we always wanted, because they see themselves on stage, they see their friends on stage, and you know, and I think ultimately that is the future of our audience. You know, the other thing is that with the advent of potentially doing more virtual stuff, and I think we continue to do that, we have an opportunity to reach a lot of more audiences. And again, I think the more diversity this cast are and the stories are, I think the better we will be, you know,
Sure.
Nationally. So
certainly in New York, unlike in the commercial theater world, unlike the resident theater world, where I tend to have the same particular audience. Ford's to a certain degree does, Arena does, but on Broadway, it's easy to do a different show that appeals to a different audience. And obviously, Vickie and Hollywood, you can chase one show can chase a completely different audience from another show. So it does seem like, at least from that point of view, there are audiences demanding a different kind of representation, a different kind of like I want to see that story with people that look like me. I don't want to see that story with people that look like what they've looked like for the past 50 years.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I would also add that, you know, by the nature of you know, increased representation across the board, not just with like race and ethnicity, but people of different abilities and different gender identities, you know, and them having opportunities to play certain roles, it then allows audiences to get to know them and want to see them in more as well. So as you brought up, like Bridgerton, you know, some like Regé-Jean, you know, wasn't well known before, but now he has a huge fan base, and that's going to only increase what he can get cast in and the stories that he can tell. And I think audiences then demand that. They want to see good people and good things. So you look at opportunity that spurs opportunity.
Yeah.
I think it's been interesting too in the past few years of the development of streaming and having services that actual people are paying for, and the advertisers aren't in charge of the bodies that are filling up the screen during screen tests. That it started, I don't know like which came first, chicken or the egg, like within theater, and then like Netflix and Apple and HBO and the different sorts of people that started to gain representation. But I do think it has affected everything around it, save for some of the more like syndicated and like and regular cable channels. But I think there has been a difference. And then some of those actors have become so well known in other mediums and have gone on to become leads in films or on Broadway, etc.
Or if you look at just in terms of an audience kind of driving or demanding something, I think you look at Power, the show Power on Stars, and it's not really written about a lot, doesn't get a lot of awards mentioned, but it has one of the highest audience numbers, maybe the highest audience numbers, definitely on Stars, but in a lot of cable TV. There have been 6 spinoffs from Power, and it's not that shows. It's been the audience loves that show. They want more. The spinoffs are giving them more, and this is without somebody telling the audience what they should like. So that's kind of an amazing story.
I love that you bring that up. I feel like what the power that is now resting with people sitting at home who can choose so easily what kind of entertainment they want is really diluting, and I think I can say this without fear of reprisal from this group, is completely diluting the power of the critic. The critic is becoming more and more marginalized. And I think that redounds to the benefit not only of the audience, like as you say, Power not getting written about at this point. I don't know if there's like the both in theater and film and in film, the divide between the tomato rating from critics and the tomato rating from audiences is getting wider and wider. And isn't that good for these art forms that are no longer beholden to just a particular standard that is promulgated by a select few critics?
You can still seek out those select few critics. I mean, I can still read the New York Times from Manola Dargis or whoever, but I guess it's more it's been democratized. I guess it's less elite in a way. So I think that's kind of good.
Yeah.
Jason, I do think that where the audience might be leading is the fact that, for example, 10, 15 years ago, I can't imagine actors that are as good as like Viola Davis having the opportunity or being seeked out to play leading roles. Like the 3 women from Hidden Figures, those women should be playing leads. So we are now finally moving who we thought as supporting actors, or we thought that they could only play certain roles, into really performers that can drive a movie and are just very powerful actors. I also feel that one of the things that is happening in trying to amplify certain stories, we're allowing great artists like Regina King, to direct her own film. And that's really a new thing that I believe is audience driven, in a way, and producers that really want to support those voices.
I think one of the great things about just the whole call for diversity is it's really been interesting to sort of watch, especially young girls of color, be able to read for roles that they would not have been able to read 4 or 5 years ago. It's not just
5 years ago.
5 years ago, yeah. It's not just the best friend or the whatever. They're like reading for complex, leading parts. So that's been kind of heartening for me to see, just because they're not being seen one-dimensionally. They have the opportunity to read for something that's not one-dimensional or just stereotypical or just, as I said, the best friend. So that's been really kind of great, great for me to see, because I see my younger self in those girls, Yeah.
Is theater, has it been the past 5 years? Where have you, Katja, Geoff, seen has it been 5 years, 10 years? Where have you seen the greatest difference? When, I should say, in terms of representation and roles being available in a different way to different segments of the acting population.
It's interesting. It's hard to say, I think, from my perspective, at least, because I think where and when I started my career, I was always sort of focused on a certain amount of diversity within it all. We didn't really look at it quite that way. So I was maybe a little naive to like how certain other what other people were contending with in some ways. And I think, you know, it's my own privilege. Like, I didn't recognize, I think, some of the problems that maybe were happening, because I think I was just pushing forward with the collaborators I was working with. But I think in the past 10 years, it's been a slow trickle that's really then really accelerated maybe within the past. I mean, I think, you know, not to be too cliche, but I think Hamilton certainly changed a lot in the theater world, just in terms of both people wanting to get on that train and people also recognizing that there's a lot of value in that. So that certainly, I think, and that was, I think, what, 5 years ago, where that I think it had a major effect in how people in theater, especially musical theater, started approaching some of this.
Yeah, I think I've always worked like with some amazing, it's been a mixed bag, but some amazing clients who I've sort of been on the same page with in this conversation for a long time too. And I worked at another office where I felt like that casting director also supported this, which has been amazing. But there has been, I think, technology and the change in technology that's happened in the past 5 years has also changed this too, because there is less of like a Rolodex method of casting or like waiting for the hand delivery. That's how it, when I started, we were hand delivered our headshots and resumes from agents. And so there is a way of accessing and seeing more people in a shorter amount of time with the way that technology has changed, even just in a submission. We can get thousands, I'm sure, Vickie, on some of your films.
Yeah.
Many thousands of submissions for one part, but they're now in thumbnail form. They're now right on my computer. I have immediate access to them. And that, I feel like you're able to get people from different walks a little bit easier. But I also, the first project I really worked on in casting.
And I'm sorry, that's just quickly to say, that's also democratized the process, right? I mean, that, like, I was talking to somebody in Vickie's office, who Vickie knows who I'm talking about, who was going to be looking at a bunch of TikTok videos later this week on a project. That getting yourself in front of decision makers is some ways much easier than it used to be. I'm sorry, Katja, didn't mean to.
No. So I no, I'm just basically saying things have changed, but I've also been lucky. When I first started, one of my first casting jobs was working on Tribes off-Broadway, looking for deaf actors in that production when I was at McCorkle Casting. But that, even I've been very fortunate to get to work on other projects that called for deaf actors, and I still think we're working on that process about who's covering translators, where does that expense come from, who's responsible for that, and I think that's another major thing as we talk about diversity. That I think I hope someday the unions can help foot that too, because I feel like there are theaters not hiring people because of financial decisions that happen in supporting those actors.
Yeah, that's a great point. I wanted to actually go to, you brought up Hamilton, Jose, you brought up Bridgerton, both examples of color conscious casting, right? When we're talking, when the character, when the race and or ethnicity of the character is essential to that character, or is very specifically the casting of it is making a point to highlight something having to do with race, as opposed to colorblind casting, which certainly, you know, James Earl Jones as Big Daddy in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, or Craig Wallace at Ford's as Scrooge, or Dev Patel as David Copperfield. Are you seeing in your respective fields, are you seeing a rise in both those kinds of both that kind of work, or are you seeing, you know, more color conscious versus color blind casting? Does it depend on the kind of show?
For me, I think that most of the teams, there's a conversation, I would like to call it color conscious casting. Just in what story are we telling without meaning to, because we're not a lot of us are not blind, and we can see color, and making sure that within the story we're not accidentally telling a separate story to an audience with preconceived notion, and making sure it's balanced and looking at different types and abilities and in what roles those can be found. I don't think any of us really can just look at something without we're not blind is basically what I'm saying. Yeah.
Well, I don't know it's interesting because I don't know if I would maybe argue that like Bridgerton and Hamilton aren't really color conscious in the way. I mean, there are certainly implications, but there's nothing about almost any of those roles that they need to be any specific ethnicity. And even like if you look at Hamilton, they've cast actors of all different ethnicities, and there's maybe a certain implication around just having actors of color play those roles. But I think to like piggyback on what Katja is saying, I think we can't be blind to history and the implications around race and gender identity and so many different other marginalized groups in this country. I mean, America just exists on a foundation of racism and sexism and a lot of other isms that are going to have an impact on the story. And I think that we have to then look at like, what does that say if the only villain on stage is a Black man, and does that then shift the story in a negative way, and is that what we want to be saying? And it gets a little complicated in that sense, and you have to be very sensitive to what story are we telling, and we have to be pretty conscious of it, even if it's like a blind cat, like it could be anybody essentially.
Yeah, for sure. Certainly seems in terms of classics, and again, I am thinking about the harder they fall, something you might that you might call classic. That there is a new drive to let those stories be seen and heard and represented by people of every sort and different races than they perhaps originally were, which is a really exciting thing. Did you can you tell us, Vickie, a little bit about in your conversations around The Harder They Fall, how y'all talked about representation?
We just wanted to sort of show a truth. I mean, there were Black cowboys. I mean, it's not trying to invent something. I mean, there was just there were Black cowboys, and why can't there be a Black version of, name a classic Western, where it's a story and it's Black people in it. And it doesn't have to just, I mean, I think maybe the political act is just having that by just doing that. But really you're telling a story, a personal story, and it has an all Black cast. So it's, the conversations were just about making something good and showing these historical figures that actually existed, although they didn't, come together in the way that they do in the film exactly. But just trying to, I guess, expose a little bit of history to people that you may not be aware of. And, the truth can be pretty interesting. The historical fact can be kind of fascinating, and it doesn't mean that you have to. I mean, I can still watch, The Searchers, or I can watch, an Anthony Mann movie, or I can still watch those movies and enjoy them for what they are. But hey, here's something else too, and enjoy that.
Yeah, for sure. What about changes in casting conversations about ability? Deaf versus hearing performers is something, Katja, that you brought up. I'm thinking of Ali Stroker, a performer in a wheelchair who won the Tony Award for Ado Annie in Oklahoma recently, just before the pandemic. How are you seeing? Are you seeing more roles written specifically for differently abled actors and characters in your respective fields?
Unfortunately, not enough, I don't think. I mean, there's definitely a couple, and we are working on a couple of shows that center around differently abled actors. Like we're casting a production of Teenage Dick, For Seattle, I cast Cost of Living that was supposed to happen at Roundhouse, but
right.
canceled because of the pandemic. I don't know if they're gonna redo it, but and those are cases where I think those communities then rally around when those shows get announced, and they all kind of come out of the woodwork in a way because they don't feel like they have opportunity elsewhere. And I think, like Katja said, it's unfortunately we're still at a place where I think a lot of it's reliant on producers and the money people, because there's so many things that need to be accounted for, whether you need to hire a translator or have an accessible backstage, or aid, health aides and things like that. Ali Stroker was a student of mine, years ago, and I've loved her and been a big fan of her forever. And it was a situation where, I couldn't get her cast in things because it was hard for teams to wrap their heads around, what that would cost them and how it would all work. And Ali, if you saw Oklahoma, she's a great dancer. Like, she can move in that chair and she can do anything that you ask her to do. And she's got a great voice, great actress. Her talent hasn't changed, but now people will fall all over themselves to try to get her. And because she's, now had this platform, and it's always a little, not funny, it's disappointing in a way, but it's interesting as a casting director, where you watch actors' careers and they can't get jobs until that one opportunity. And we get to work with theater like Arena and Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and certain theaters we work with have basically had an kind of an unofficial mandate, but sometimes it's actually kind of official, around making sure that we're inclusive in any which way possible, and we'll bend over backwards to try to accommodate whoever is the best for the role. But a lot of theaters aren't quite there yet.
Yeah.
I don't know how that plays out in film and TV, though.
Well, I guess what has to happen is, I do think that there's a desire to represent people with disabilities in film and TV, and I think there's a certain sort of, I guess, performers with disabilities or people with disabilities can now think that, oh, I can maybe have a career, I could maybe be on a TV show. So maybe some of that has to sort of catch up to a sort of a new reality that's sort of burgeoning. But yeah, I think there's a desire just to be representative, and then you have to find the person who is representative, who is also right for the part and good. It comes down to that. So
Here's that weird talent thing.
Yeah.
All right, so let's, having talked about representation generally, a representation a little bit in terms of race and ability, let's talk about sort of this beauty part. I'm going to sort of date myself, and I invite you all to not necessarily date yourselves, but share something in a similar way. Okay, for me, growing up, and this is obviously long before I realized that I was going to marry a man, for me, it was like Lee Majors as Steve Austin in The $6 Million Man, and Lindsay Wagner as the Bionic Woman. Like, that was my conception of the ideal. That's what media was telling me, and I was totally buying. Like, you're going to be masculinity and leading maleness is the one, beauty is the other. Where, when you were, what would you say it doesn't have to be your first or early cues, but media wise, how did you come to believe what was beautiful? What did you see that was like, oh yeah, that's beauty as a kid? Or what were you told this was beauty in the media?
Well,
I would invite audience members to, I don't actually have and Emily in our backstage, if you get questions, if you want to put them into the chat about what other people felt who are watching was beauty when they were growing up, I would love to see those.
I mean, I'll just say, I think for me, I've always felt like it's probably a lot. I mean, I would imagine it's a lot harder for women, because it's, at least from my growing up, like, you know, there was that steady stream of like 17 magazine and those kinds of, you know, images that were being presented as ideal and perfect. And this is what you're supposed to look like and how you're supposed to operate. And I don't, I wasn't as maybe susceptible or aware of that in the same way. And because I maybe came up more in the theater world, you know, people like Bernadette Peters and people like that are beautiful to me, but obviously she's not, you know, the quintessential beauty in the world. But, you know, I think in the theater world, there's maybe a little bit more latitude because you're not, you know, up close in somebody's face, and you really, really need the talent to back it up. Whereas in certain, you know, film or TV roles, you can kind of edit around it, I would imagine. Whereas in theater, you know, you can wig somebody and maybe make them look a little better, but they really need to back it up with being able to sing or being able to really carry that show 8 times a week. So I think, you know, obviously, like I grew up watching like Friends and things like that when I was, you know, kind of coming into casting, and that was like the look and the ideal, but I don't know that it maybe translated quite the same way into like my work.
Yeah. Charlie's Angels. Yes.
So I grew up a little bit in the dance world. So had a really convoluted and difficult relationship in regards to weight and how that correlates with beauty in my life for a long time. I would say well into a couple years into casting, really. Had a difficult time with it. And I do think if there's any like dancers in the audience, that's something that a lot of dancers deal with. But I will say that between, as Geoff was saying, 17 magazine and even like Tiger Beat magazine, which was something around when I was a kid, it was a huge thing. And then in the ballet world, it becomes a real problem and a fake problem all at the same time when you're talking about lifts, when you're talking about point shoes, when you're talking about certain things and certain logistical things. So I quit ballet and I went into acting instead and found like a healthier relationship with dance that way. But dance definitely affected my view as a child.
Yeah. Thank you, Jillian, for this great comment. By the way, which I think you all can see. Certainly have. And I was just talking to somebody about Judy Garland being, you know, how her on-screen appearance was so manipulated by executives to conform with an external notion of beauty, and weight, especially such a cudgel with which, especially for women.
Yeah.
You know, interestingly enough, for me, I've gone through many phases, Jason, but, you know, because I understand now as an adult that Hollywood really dictated certain notions of beauty and elegance, like, you know, Grace Kelly, Audrey Hepburn. And yet, you know, because I grew up in Puerto Rico, to us, Rita Moreno was just the epitome of beauty. In the 70s, because Cicely Tyson looked like both of my grandmothers, or my grandmothers looked like Cicely Tyson. When I saw Sounder, I just thought she was the most beautiful woman I have ever seen, you know, because she looked like my grandmothers, you know, and she was of the earth, earthy. You know, but certainly we know that Hollywood and the fashion industry work in tandem to create these notions of beauty. You know, you take a film like Bonnie and Clyde and Faye Dunaway's look, you know, it dictated fashion for years to come. Now my notion of beauty is entirely different. You know, I'm going to speak way out there. You know, Jade Jones is the most beautiful woman I know in DC, period. I mean, she was in our production of Into the Woods. She played Little Red. She broke my heart every night. And that's a thing of great beauty, you know, for an actor to be able to do that. And you have her now, but not for long, because we hope we have her back in sports. So, you know. So, you know, and then because now I'm a 60-year-old man, you look at, you know, the ageism factor disappears. You look at people that are in their 70s and you're like, ooh, I want to be like that when I'm that age. They're beautiful, they're handsome, they're elegant, you know. But anyways, there you have it.
And I think for me, I think, I was a little girl when I guess the whole Black is Beautiful movement sort of started, so luckily, I mean, I really looked at so many movies and television, and I love Audrey Hepburn, and, she's great, and, but I never really saw anybody really that looked like me. But luckily, as I was growing up, like I said, the Black is Beautiful movement started, and there seemed to be a new appreciation for Black beauty, whether it's on magazine covers or TV shows or whatever. So, I'm just glad that happened. Glad it's still going, and glad you can see somebody like Michaela Cole, as the of a TV show who you wouldn't necessarily, cast, and she's the bolder you get in your casting choices, I think you can really sort of change people's minds about sort of what beauty is, and you have someone like her who has access to an HBO show where she's in your living room, 10 episodes, once a week, and you start to kind of, on first glance, you might think, that's not what I think is beautiful, or that's not what I'm used to seeing, or however you want to put it. But I think the more you see and you go, oh, okay, that can be beautiful as well, and just as beautiful as anything else, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely, it makes 100% sense. And I mean, Michaela Cole is a great example, as we're talking about Jade Jones on stage at Olney or Ford's, or I know Geoff and Katja know her, and she's a star. The changing representation as regards beauty is so hugely important. And I'm not, by the way, forgetting Maureen's great question about colorism. Thank you. But I sort of want to go back to just sort of what exactly you were saying. Obviously, it's so impactful when somebody as striking looking as Michaela Cole comes on and just changes your perception. So are you finding directors, are you finding producers more excited now to be like, okay, I'm not worried about, you don't have to get me the traditionally beautiful, whatever it is I'm looking for. Show me something different. Show me stuff that is outside the box that I'm not expecting.
That's slower.
That's slower.
What I think it's interesting is, Michaela Cole is such a great example, but, she also wrote herself into opportunity.
Yep.
Had she not created chewing gum, and had she not, created, multiple roles for herself to show her off. I was also thinking, when we were talking about just actors with disabilities, Ryan O'Connell, who created a TV show for himself, is another great example where he wrote and starred in a show and put himself as kind of a romantic lead. And then all of a sudden, as you're watching it, you start to become comfortable and normalized with, and maybe, an actor with cerebral palsy as a romantic lead. And I think then that puts that into the ethos a little bit more, and maybe clues certain creative teams into, oh, this is possible. Whereas I do think it still can be a challenge when, we bring those actors in, with no kind of context around them, to really get people on board as quickly, because they don't see the value necessarily. They don't see how that works.
Right. So a lot of still falling on the shoulders of that particular actor. And I'm not this has nothing to do with how Phoebe Waller-Bridge looks, for example, but there's an example of somebody who may not be traditionally cast worthy, created her own work that right. Let me ask you another sort of a weird thing about this specifically. Well, I don't know if it specifically has to do with, well, I think it does have to do with women and standards of beauty. So beautiful actresses, in quotes, saluted for playing non-beautiful characters, not taken seriously unless they are, Charlize Theron in Monster. Is there hypocrisy about if you are a perceived if you are beautiful according to a received notion of beauty, that you are somehow not a serious actress if you are a woman, and it's not until you make yourself up and take on an ugly role that you are given serious consideration? Or is that something I'm making up completely by myself?
No, I think there's something to be said for that. I mean, it's trying to, I think, just, I don't know Shirley's, but I imagine that she just wanted to have herself seen beyond her beauty and wanted an acting role, like a challenging acting role. And look, it came in this particular character. I don't know that she had to be made. I guess to get rid of the Charlize, she had to kind of go and make herself up to look completely different. So yeah, I do think that sometimes for beautiful actresses, sometimes you have to kind of get down in the dirt a little bit and show that you can act. But I think beautiful actresses have an advantage over. I mean, look, it's a business run mainly by men, and so I think certain casting choices are going to be affected by what the male producers, studio people, it's what they're attracted to, and you have a certain amount of power over that sometimes, and other times you don't. So.
Great question from Shelley. Does diversity also cover age discrimination? How are we finding things changing in terms of age and performer on stage? I know we're doing it only in March, Dance Nation by Claire Barron, that ran off Broadway before the pandemic. It was a Pulitzer nominee story about a preteen dance troupe in which all the predominantly female preteen dance troupe in which the girls are played by actresses between the ages of 20 and 70. As a way to sort of connect to there's a lot to it. But are we seeing more actors of every age, especially in terms of women, getting representation and considered?
I think we're still a little bit behind there too, unless it's a role that's specifically written for an older actor. I still think there are sort of perceptions of what will bring audiences into a theater, a movie theater, or to going for a certain demographic of an audience with certain films or TV shows. So Twitter followers and Instagram followers, and that sort of is been coming up more and more in terms of some casting. So that lends itself to a younger sort of audience. I don't know. In theater, is it different in theater, you guys, just in terms of?
It's a little different.
Yeah.
I think we're unless you're in like real commercial theater where they're at a point where they need to really bring in audience aside from what they already have. They may look to the kind of TikTok folks, but yeah, I don't know. I think I agree. I think with what you said is the bottom line too, is about these roles need to be written for people of that age, because I think, it's very much in line with, any sort of, diversity, in that everything has its own implication and you can't ignore what story you're telling. So having a female lead, we can't legally ask how old anybody is. That's actual discrimination, for theater specifically, at least, unless you're under 18, and then we need to know if you're legally able to work. But it's how old you play, and it's what you look like. And you could be 22 years old, but read like you are in your 40s, and you might not feel right for that role. And you could be, there are actresses that are in their mid 40s that still play teenagers, on stage at least. And I think that it comes back to what story you're telling, and making sure you're telling the correct story with the correct implications around it. I do think there's obviously a plethora of older actors that I wish were more active on stage because there were roles for them always. But that, again, comes from the top down. And it sounds like, Jason, with the production you're talking about, that's a conscious like choice of casting older actors in the same way that Spelling Bee, casts older actors to play kids as part of the conceit of the show, versus just, being totally blind to it, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I think we're coming up on towards the conclusion of this panel and opening this up completely for questions. I think what certainly one of the things we're hearing is that what the audience demands can only go so far. Writers writers choosing to write roles with different folks in mind, taking their power. Actresses, like we've been talking about, like Michaela Cole, using their power to make representation happen. There's systemic issues that have to be addressed. We certainly, the 2020 Hollywood Diversity Report, 91% of C-level positions are held by white people, and 82% of those are men. And I would like to think that theater is better and more representative, but pretty sure it's not. So there's that as well. And I want to also point to what, Jose, you said, that Hollywood and fashion work together in tandem, even if there isn't a secret cabal meeting about who's going to be in the print spreads this month or on television spreads this month. Obviously, the fashion world has a huge role to play. Before we take additional questions, I do want to go back to questions of colorism. Questions about colorism, and I don't know if any of you have anything to say about that. We know that certainly the In the Heights movie, the In the Heights film, Lin-Manuel Miranda got into some hot Twitter water about not having dark-skinned Latino enough dark-skinned Latino actors in the show. There we go. Thank you. Thank you, Maureen. Zazie Beats, sorry, as Stagecoach Mary and The Harder They Fall. Any thoughts from you all on charges of colorism in terms of representation?
I think it still exists that, I think lighter skin has been better for a long time for Black actresses, but I think that's changing, and thanks to even sort of early pioneers like Cicely and other actresses now, whether it's Michaela Cole now. So I think colorism does still exist, yeah, and I think again, when you're dealing with an industry, the statistics you just mentioned, 80% male, in Hollywood, I think, look, we as casting directors have to deal with the experiences and taste of a lot of men in positions of power, what they think is beautiful or what they think a Latino person in their life would be doing. So you kind of fight the battles you can fight and try to change perceptions behind the camera so that things can be a little differently seen in front of the camera. And sometimes you win those and sometimes you lose.
Yeah. Jose?
It's again, I'm going to go back to the what story are we telling? Because, for example, in the case of the film version of In the Heights, Lin-Manuel is from Puerto Rico and so am I, but interestingly enough, the population of our island is diverse, but it was mixed with the Spanish that really came to colonize Puerto Rico. So, we have one very specific rainbow. However, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which share the island of Hispaniola, definitely that color was not represented in that film. And, it was really strange why that happened, whether it was intentional or whether it was like, oops, what have we done after the film had been shot. It's an interesting conversation to be had, but I also have to say shamefully that Hollywood has always preferred light-skinned Black performers. It's things are changing, but that rainbow tends to stay in some hues more than others, and that's just really, you see it in commercials, you see it in print media, you see it everywhere. Theater is changing. I think in that sense, some of the theaters, Lord theaters and regional theaters may be actually doing slightly better from my perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's challenging. My one of my biggest takeaways from the last year or so was just that there's always more work to be done, and there's always more, self-reflecting and recognizing, where biases may exist that you don't even know exist. I mean, as a white person too, I feel like I have a certain, I'm on the outside of certain kind of conversations in terms of, how it feels to certain people. But then it's also interesting because I've found a lot of Black directors I've worked with are the first to sort of talk about colorism and how important skin tone is in the storytelling. And that's something that's always very interesting to navigate, because that's not something I feel like I can have a real point of view on, because it's not, part of my life. And I don't know. I don't think it would be appropriate for me to add myself in there. But it certainly becomes sometimes very cognizantly part of the conversation of, like, how this affects the story within a family unit or within, a cultural, dynamic within a community. I would like to believe in something like In the Heights, which I had nothing to do with. The casting process is vast, and I don't know that anybody was sitting there looking to just exclude anybody. It may have just gotten to the point where, a pretty large percentage of the creative team were people of color that just maybe weren't conscious of it, and now it's something that they're more conscious of because it was addressed. But I think we always need to be like reflecting on where we are and how we can do better.
So as we, I want to encourage us, and Emily, if you have additional questions, we'll take a couple more. But let me throw this around to each of you. How can we do better in terms of expanding the notion of beauty in our respective fields? What are things that, whether it's producers, writers, and casting directors, what can we do? And Katja, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, and as we've touched upon, like it depends on the process of how much control the casting director has. But one of the things we do have control over is how the language and how the description of a character can get out into the world too. And so I do think it's taking some agency over how we describe someone. And I really feel that taking less like unimportant verbs out and getting active things about the character and who they are and what they want becomes incredibly important. And that's something we can do to expand the pool. I remember like starting in the industry, like when the description would be like beautiful, but doesn't know it. It's like, what does that mean? Like, who is this character and what does she want? And to loop back to what Jillian's question was too, I think that there's an element of training programs currently, and I know there's been a reckoning in the BFA and other college training programs, but there was like this dangerous standard, I think, for a while about putting actors into these like very specific boxes, or even forcing them into boxes like vocally that actually didn't suit them. So I just want to say to like Jillian, and there was another actor who commented about getting thrown into these really off types. If you were a 25-year-old person, take it upon yourself to look for material for someone your own age and start getting that in your body and start getting confident with it, because you are 25 and you probably play 25 or close to it, and you're not going to be playing the mom or the best friend forever. So try to take it upon yourself and have your own agency in embodying a character that you want to. So you want to say.
So Jason, I recently, this is a different example, but this last week, was socially connecting with some actors in town, and was very happy to see this particular actress who I haven't seen for several months. And, it's really interesting. She looks stunning in her gray hair. I mean, I was just like, that's so incredible. And she said, well, enjoy it for a few more days, because I have to color it in order to go back to audition. And I just was, what? She said, I wouldn't be cast. I mean, that's that, and this is an actor who is middle-aged. And I was, that's again, what is that defining beauty? That gray hair needs to go away. It's tied to ageism. It's tied to other things that are terrible. I mean, and this, I'm not going to reveal the name. This is like one of the most talented actors in our town. She's known. She gets hired everywhere. And yet, she's a great-haired, middle-aged.
Yeah. Well, it's because she can be wigged if she needed to be. So it's like...
Exactly. So,
I'm thinking of an amazing actress who I offered a role to. That is the character is she's supposed to be in her 80s, and this actress would not take the role because she was afraid she would never be seen as younger than 80 if she took that role.
Yeah,
even in our little theater. Before, I loved Susan Rome's question, if we have time to get to it, but before we get to it, Vickie, Geoff, anything else about what we can do to do better?
I think kind of check our own biases and our own assumptions and our own, like, why do I want to cast that person? It's because I haven't seen that type of casting already in a movie, or is there a fresher way to do it? So I think for me, I just want to continue to check my own, I don't know if you call them biases or my own assumptions, or, just so that's a thing. It's just a kind of just,
Yeah.
Jason, I also think that, at least for us who are in charge of casting, we're seriously talking, at least at Ford's, and I've heard the conversation in other places. We need to come down with a set of agreements that we share with everyone who's coming into that room. And those agreements, people need to know what our values are, and they need to know, for example, that in our room we're not going to talk or shame body types, or we're not going to do this, or if you come with those preconceived notions, you can't work with us, because we see the world different. And I think that whether it's a set of rules or agreements, and it shouldn't be our job to teach the people that are actually should know better. But I just feel that it's a responsibility. We have to stand for what we believe, and we have to show people that imagination and possibilities is where the beauty is found, so.
Lovely. Thank you, Jose. Does anybody want to, it's a little bit off topic, but I love Susan Rome's question, and I love Susan Rome. She's going to be in one of our shows shortly. Does anybody want to address this question? Jew-face casting non-Jews in stories where ethnicity is central to the story? ? It has been interestingly was addressed most recently in the Washington D.C. Washington Jewish Week periodical. A few folks sort of talked about it. Interestingly, well, I don't want to paraphrase, because I think I might paraphrase it wrong. Any of you have any thoughts on this question?
I do. Well, as a Jewish person myself, and as somebody, when I was younger, before I started losing some of my hair, I had a lot of very blonde, curly hair, blue eyes, and would never have been cast in Fiddler on the Roof or something like that. So I think it becomes a really challenging conversation, and it's one I talk to, certain talent representatives about a lot, and other colleagues about, because I mean, it goes back to the same thing I had said earlier, is like we can't legally ask certain things, nor should we be. I think it comes down to what somebody plays. And I think as Sarah sort of talks about in the article, you know, unfortunately there's become this like definition of what a Jewish person looks like, and relies on certain like tropes and stereotypes. So that even if somebody wasn't Jewish, you know, if they fall into that, then they get cast as a Jew, and if they don't fall into that, then they're not correct for it. And I think it's a challenging area to navigate, in the same way that I think, as Jose kind of referenced in terms of the Latinx community, you know, what Latinx looks like is very different depending on where you come from and what your lineage is. And, you know, when you are talking about an ethnicity or a religion, there's a wide stance there. And I'm not quite sure how to navigate it, in the sense that, like, you know, in certain shows I've worked on where there's essentially been a mandate around, we want to cast authentically Jewish actors. You know, I find myself weirdly like finding people's social media, or like analyzing their last names or what languages they speak, or things like that also feel very reductive. You know, in the same way that I look at Latinx performers, and it's like, oh, well, if their last name is a certain thing, then that maybe means they're Latinx, even regardless of their skin tone. And I think it's just a really dicey territory, because I do feel strongly that Jewish people should have the opportunity to play Jews, and that unfortunately there's a lot of major examples where non-Jewish people are cast in those roles regularly. And when anything becomes an overall, you know, or too much of a trend, that feels a little concerning. But I, you know, again, not to like pass the buck, but it's like, what story are we telling, and does this person fit into that world? I cast a production of a musical that is very specifically about a Jewish actor that, you know, is Enter Laughing, the musical that Carl Reiner wrote, and, you know, Joe Stein and a very Jewish team were involved in, and it was all relied on Jewish humor and sensibility, and the actor we cast in it is Southern Baptist, and I didn't really know when we were casting him, but at the end of the day, it didn't matter. His whole career has been playing Jews. I don't think he would get cast as anything other than a Jew, because he understands that culture and that world. So why should he be precluded from doing that? So I think it's really
it gets a little weird. When you know, just the absolutes.
Yeah.
I just don't feel comfortable.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I want to add, I'm a big fan of you, Susan Rome. So thank you for the question.
Any last question before we wrap up? I think that means there's nothing in the queue at the moment. So I'm going to say thank you to you four for taking time on your Monday night or Monday afternoon in Los Angeles. Geoff, thank you, because you're not feeling particularly well, for being part of this. Hopefully it wasn't too stressful. But this is great, and I really appreciate everything you said, Katja. Some really great suggestions. I mean, I was just reading something about breakdowns and changing the way breakdowns get written, and, you know, all these great points and comments. So I appreciate this conversation very much. I thank you. I thank you all for tuning in, whoever did, and look forward to seeing you at Beauty and the Beast, or Hedwig for the holidays, or Christmas Carol, or Christmas Carol at our theater, or at Ford's Theater, or who knows, wherever. Congratulations, and thank you to all of you. Thanks again, and have a great night.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you, Jason.
Take care.